The night had gently settled over the quiet village, wrapping the hills and thatched roofs in a soft, velvety silence. The outlines of distant trees became hazy in the moonlight, and the autumn wind rustled slowly through the golden wheat fields. The scent of dried hay mingled with the crisp evening air, as if the land itself was sighing in sleep. Inside a small wooden cottage on the edge of the fields, a single oil lamp flickered weakly, casting a golden glow that danced along the walls. The room smelled of old wood, metal, and smoke. At the center of the room sat a man on a short stool, carefully repairing a worn-out iron plow. His hands were large and weathered, and the lamplight traced each line on his face like brushstrokes on a painting. His work was steady, quiet, almost ritualistic, like he was mending time itself. In the far corner of the room, a young boy, no older than 6 or 7, lay curled on a bed made of straw and old linen. But he wasn't asleep. His eyes, wide and curious, followed every movement of his father's hands. He listened closely to the soft sounds, the clicking of gears, the gentle tightening of bolts, the sigh of metal yielding to touch. It was a lullaby made not of words, but of work. In his tiny hands, the boy held a rusted cogwheel, turning it slowly between his fingers, tracing the worn teeth with his thumb. "Why did it break?" he asked softly. His father didn't answer right away. He tested the fixed plow handle with a firm twist, satisfied when the parts held together. Then he looked at his son and said with a faint smile, "Because time used it well." The boy didn't fully understand the words, but something about them sank deep inside him. He looked again at the tool, not as a broken object, but as a companion, something that had lived, worked, and now rested in his father's care. He began to wonder, if a gear could talk, what would it say? Could a bolt grow tired? Was a machine not just a thing, but something with a quiet, waiting spirit? That night, the boy dreamt for the first time of becoming part of a great machine, a small nut tucked into the heart of a strange, humming engine. The machine made no sound, yet it breathed. It carried people across dark skies and made seeds bloom into golden fields. It felt alive. From that day on, he began collecting forgotten parts from behind the shed. Broken handles, bent nails, pieces of wire, and rusted screws, things others discarded, he gathered with care. He didn't know what he was building, only that when he brought them together, something inside him lit up. Like a puzzle no one had seen, beginning to reveal its shape. Sometimes, he'd tie old springs to pieces of driftwood, turning them into spinning wheels. Other times, he'd bind copper strips with twine, pretending they could store sunlight. He placed his creations beneath his bed, like secrets. Or he'd leave one beside his mother's loom and watch her laugh softly, turning the strange object in her hands. "This little thing spins quite cheerfully," she would say, never scolding, only smiling. He didn't yet know the word inventor. He didn't dream of fame or future. He only knew that when something moved, shone, or made a sound, it was magic. Just like the stars above, still and distant, yet lighting the world without a sound. This was where his dream began. Not in a palace, nor in a city of stone, but in a humble village, under a flickering lamp, beside a pile of forgotten things. With a child's eyes that saw possibility in every broken gear, and a heart that believed even metal could one day speak. The sky hung low over the quiet village, a blanket of gray clouds pressing gently upon the rooftops. There was no wind, no thunder, only the soft, steady sound of spring rain falling like whispered thoughts from the heavens. It was the first rain of the season. The droplets tapped rhythmically against the thatched roofs, slid down wooden eaves, and kissed the soil with a sound so gentle it could have been mistaken for silence. The air smelled of wet earth and fresh grass, and every stone and branch seemed softened, blurred, as if the whole world was exhaling. The boy, now a little taller, his head just reaching his father's chest, had changed too. No longer content to merely watch, he had begun to make things. Small things. Quiet things. Things only he understood. Little inventions with no names and no clear purpose, but filled with intent. The shed behind their house had become his secret workshop. It was filled with discarded pieces from the village, broken tools, rusted chains, snapped handles, dented pots. To others, it was junk. But to him, it was possibility. Each item held a sliver of a future machine, waiting to be remembered. Among all the items, he loved the gears most. He had found them in the cracked belly of a forgotten clock. Some were large and golden, others tiny and blackened with age. He would polish them, organize them by size, and store them in a wooden box lined with old cloth. Each one felt like it had its own story, a quiet ticking soul. On this rainy afternoon, he sat alone on a crate in the corner of the shed, surrounded by parts and possibilities. The rain made soft music on the tin roof, and the light from the tiny window spilled like diluted gold across the workbench. He was working on something new, a small device that could be powered by rain itself. He had noticed how raindrops hitting a certain spot on the gutter created a subtle vibration, and an idea had taken root. What if water, falling naturally, freely, could bring something to life? Using a bent copper lid, thin string, and a set of tiny gears, he built a simple contraption. It was clumsy, crude, and fragile, but he believed in it. He positioned the device just beneath the roof's edge, where the rain would fall in steady drips onto the copper surface. Then, he waited. Nothing happened at first. Just the soft tap of rain on metal. But he kept watching, motionless, barely breathing. Then, slowly, quietly, one of the smallest gears trembled, and turned. His heart skipped. It was just a fraction of movement, but it was enough. He leaned back against the shed's wooden wall, folding his arms around his knees, and simply watched. The gears moved with each drop. It was slow, uncertain, but alive. Something he had imagined, something that had lived only in the drawings of his mind, was now moving in the world. When his mother called for supper, he didn't answer. He was too deep in his own world. It wasn't until his father came to find him, umbrella in hand, that the boy looked up. His father saw the odd contraption, gently humming with each drop of rain, and gave a small nod. "You," he said, "will build something great one day." The boy didn't reply. He didn't need to. He wasn't chasing greatness, he was chasing motion. That single, beautiful moment when an idea becomes real. That night, as he lay in bed, the rain still whispering against the walls, he stared up at the wooden ceiling and replayed the tiny turning of that gear in his mind. Over and over again. It became the quiet rhythm that guided him to sleep. It was in that moment he understood a new kind of power, not loud, not forceful, but steady and persistent. Like a drop of rain. like the whisper of gears in the stillness of a storm. The sun had not yet fully risen. A soft orange hue painted the horizon, and a thin layer of mist hung low over the fields like a veil of dreams not yet shaken from the world. Dew clung delicately to the blades of grass, and the air was cool, laced with the scent of damp earth and morning silence. The boy, not so little anymore, moved with quiet confidence. He had grown into a calmness that wasn't forced, but earned. His hands, though small, were certain. And his eyes carried a thoughtful focus, one that no longer sought approval but only understanding. Over the months, he had become fluent in a language of parts and pressure, of wheels and wires. Others still didn't know what to make of him or his quiet creations, and that was fine. He wasn't building for applause. He was listening, to ideas, to instincts, to the whisper of something just beneath the surface of things. This morning, before even the roosters had stirred, he sat cross-legged on a patch of dry soil behind the house. Before him lay his most ambitious creation yet, a curious mix of wood, bent metal, twine, and small water jars. It looked clunky, almost chaotic, but each part had a purpose. This was his first true invention, a self-watering device for the field. The idea had taken root weeks ago when he overheard an elder complain, "The earth dries too quickly. No one can stand by the trench all day." The boy had nodded to himself, filed the thought away, and begun sketching that very evening. What if, he had wondered, water could know when to flow? What if rain didn't need hands to guide it? He had tested each part for weeks. Some failed immediately. Others worked only in theory. He learned to wait, to test again, to quietly rebuild. This was not a race, but a quiet unfolding. Now, in the soft hush of dawn, the last piece was ready. With steady breath, he nudged a small wooden lever at the base of the contraption. A firm click echoed, one gear shifted, then another. The water jar tipped gently, pouring into a shallow channel that spun a wooden wheel. The rotation triggered a delicate series of movements, pulleys pulling taut, levers rising, and finally, a latch was released. Another jar tipped. Water began to flow, not all at once, but in gentle pulses, guided by the machine he had imagined only in his notebook not long ago. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He simply leaned closer, knees drawn to his chest, listening. Click. Whir. Drip. Pause. Click. The machine was breathing. Not in the way people do, but in rhythm. Each gear turned with purpose, each drop falling like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. He pressed his ear to the wooden base, and in the stillness, he felt it, a subtle, pulsing vibration. It wasn't much, but it was real. He had given shape to something invisible. He had brought motion where there had only been thought. It was the first time he truly understood what it meant to create. Not to assemble. Not to copy. But to bring forth. To summon. Later that afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the cracks of the window in his room, he redrew the entire device in his notebook, line by line. Every screw, every thread, every flow. And at the bottom corner, in small, careful letters, he wrote, "My first machine with a heartbeat." That evening, he didn't reach for new parts. He didn't sketch anything new. He just sat outside under the darkening sky, watching as the stars blinked into view, one by one. He thought of the machine, now still, resting behind the house. He imagined it sleeping, its gears at peace. And his own heart, so often stirred by doubt and silence, beat gently in his chest, slow, soft, like a distant echo of the machine he had made. A quiet understanding settled over him. Even the smallest idea, born in stillness, can become a pulse. A rhythm. A heartbeat. The wind still carried a chill, though spring was slowly brushing its fingertips across the land. Outside the quiet village, the trees were budding with pale green, and the stream, once frozen in silence, now rippled gently in the morning mist. A slow, steady train pulled into the edge of a small country station, its wheels grinding softly along the tracks like a giant breathing in its sleep. The engine sighed, releasing warm clouds of steam that curled and vanished into the early sky. At the platform stood the boy, older now, taller, a little leaner. Slung across his shoulder was a rough sack made of coarse linen. Inside were a few changes of clothes, several hand-drawn schematics, and a small wooden box filled with tiny gears, springs, and screws. To anyone else, it was junk. But to him, it was memory. It was soul. His mother's eyes were red, but she didn't cry. His father said only one thing as he placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder: "If you're going to learn, learn deeply." It was the boy's first journey away from home. His first time boarding a train, his first time watching his childhood disappear slowly through a fogged window. The train wasn't fast. It moved gently through the valleys, its soft whistles echoing over the fields. The sound of the tracks, that quiet, rhythmic clack-clack clack-clack, was like a lullaby with no words. He sat alone in a window seat, clutching the small wooden box in his lap. The world passed by slowly. Fields, trees, sheep grazing, an old footbridge, all slipping away behind him. He didn't feel sad. He just watched, eyes wide, like watching a dream fading into another. The box glowed faintly in the sunlight filtering through the curtains. Inside, the gears shimmered like stars in a small, private universe. He opened the lid carefully, touched each metal piece gently, as though greeting old friends. He imagined the city, that faraway place described in old books, where buildings reached toward the sky and streets glowed with light even at midnight. He imagined voices, questions, challenges, machines he'd never seen before. He knew he wasn't educated the way others might be. His handwriting was awkward, his reading slow. But he had hands that understood tension and weight, a mind that could follow the dance of balance and friction, and a heart that beat with the rhythm of invention. When the train finally arrived, the station was larger than anything he had ever seen. Stone columns soared into the sky. Metal and glass glittered like frost in sunlight. People moved everywhere, in pairs, in crowds, with haste and chatter. He didn't panic. He moved like a quiet shadow, slipping through the current of footsteps, his eyes drinking in everything. With a map folded in his hand, he found his way to the edge of the city, to an old, nearly forgotten workshop nestled between two brick warehouses. Its sign was faded, and the brass bell above the door jingled with a tired sound. Inside, the air was thick with iron dust and a sharp smell of oil. The owner was an older man with silver hair and thick glasses that made his eyes seem twice their size. He didn't speak much. He simply nodded toward the table and said, "Let's see what you've brought." The boy carefully laid out his schematics, each page worn at the edges, corners smudged with graphite and oil. His fingers trembled slightly, but his voice was steady as he described each mechanism, each imagined function. The old man said nothing at first. He studied the pages, furrowed his brow, then finally looked up. "You're not from a school," he said. "But you understand the language of metal." That was enough. The boy was offered a corner cot in the back room. The days became filled with dust, motion, quiet. He swept the floors, sorted bolts, filed metal, listened. The workshop was full of devices he had never seen, some strange, some beautiful. But he wasn't afraid. He watched them with wonder, as if listening to music he hadn't yet learned to play. At night, he would sit on his cot, open the wooden box, and begin crafting. Small things, always. Never finished. Never perfect. But full of thought. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't building for anyone. He was simply keeping his dream alive, one quiet piece at a time. In this strange city of noise and smoke, he had begun the long work of turning ideas into machines. And he believed, deeply, quietly, that somewhere in the hidden corners of this place, his rhythm would be heard. Night came slowly over the city, like a silk curtain falling one fold at a time. Street lamps glowed in the mist, their amber light blooming softly against cobblestone and glass. Inside the workshop, a single window remained lit, a quiet golden square in the darkness, constant, calm, like a watchful eye. It was the boy's 17th night in the city. During the day, the workshop was a storm of sound. Hammers meeting anvils with sharp clinks, sparks dancing from grinding wheels, and the low churning of gears being tested, turned, and retuned. But once the sun set, everything changed. The noise faded into memory, and what remained was an echo, not loud, but ever present, like the sigh of the workshop itself. He had begun to love the night. He would wait until the others were gone or asleep, then quietly gather his box of parts. In the stillness of the after hours, he wasn't just an assistant. He was an inventor. A dreamer. A listener. Each night, he selected a few pieces, a gear, a copper coil, perhaps a curved piece of tin or a spring, and laid them out carefully on the workbench. The lamp above cast a soft halo over the table, and from outside, a gentle breeze sometimes slipped in, carrying the smell of river water and smoke. His fingers moved slowly, like a musician tuning strings he hadn't yet plucked. He wasn't building to finish. He wasn't building to show. He was building to hear. He often whispered to himself, "Metal breathes too, if you're quiet enough." And he believed it. That night, he was working on something new, a tiny mechanism inspired by the turning of a water wheel. It was delicate, nothing more than a palm-sized collection of levers and gears, designed to respond to the softest tap of a droplet. It had taken him days to design, not because it was complicated, but because it was precise. It required balance, between gravity and tension, between silence and motion. Outside, the bell tower struck 10. He paused, listening to the reverberation drift through the night air. Inside, the flame in the lamp wavered slightly, casting dancing shadows across the blueprints. The mechanism was nearly done. He adjusted one last copper wire, then sat back, gazing at it without touching. It didn't move. It didn't shine. But it was full of waiting. He leaned closer, resting his head against the table, ear to the wood. He imagined the moment it would come alive, not with noise, but with a single, subtle movement. A gear turning in response to water. A breath where there had been none. To most, it was nothing. But to him, it was the beginning of a language. He scribbled something in the corner of his notebook. I heard them tonight, the gear and the drop. They said, if you listen long enough, we'll take you far. He didn't test the mechanism that night. He didn't need to. He had already felt its rhythm forming. Later, he blew out the lamp, folded the blueprints, and tucked the tiny machine into his wooden box. Then he curled up on the cot beside the furnace, his head resting on his folded arms, the room humming with the warmth of sleeping machines. Even in the stillness, he could feel it, the memory of movement, the promise of motion. In a workshop full of silent tools and slumbering iron, his thoughts clicked gently like clockwork. And somewhere between gear and silence, between dream and waking, a new idea was already whispering its first breath. At the heart of the city stood an old clock tower. It wasn't grand. Its stones were weathered, its hands rusted, and its walls leaned just slightly with the weight of years. But still, day after day, when the bell rang out, people across the city paused, not to check the time, but to listen. To let the sound wrap around them like a ritual. That morning, the boy was asked to go there. The workshop master had said only, the tower's off. Go and see. He didn't ask questions. He packed his tools, slipped his small wooden box into his satchel, and began the quiet walk through the city's winding streets. Spring sunlight spilled across cobblestones. The baker's window smelled of sweet crusts. Pigeons fluttered across wires. But beneath the tower's shadow, it was quieter, like a corner of the world not quite awake. He pushed open a heavy wooden door. It creaked, slow and tired. Inside was a spiraling staircase, narrow and worn, climbing into the tower like a forgotten spine. Without hesitation, he began the ascent. Step by step. The stairs groaned softly beneath his feet. Dust drifted in the thin light slipping through the cracks. Higher and higher, until at last, he reached the clock chamber. It was a square room, walled in time. On each side, faded glass clock faces peered out into the city. In the center stood the mechanism, a dense lattice of gears and rods, brass and steel, like a forest of silent machinery. Sunlight poured through the upper windows, catching the suspended dust, turning the room golden and still. He stood there a moment, simply listening. There was movement, slow, consistent, but something was off. A hesitation. A tiny stumble in the rhythm. Not a full stop, not yet. But enough to disturb the harmony. Like a single wrong note in an otherwise beautiful melody. He approached the gears carefully. Ran his fingers along the cool metal. He could feel it, a slight drag, a breath that came half a second too late. He didn't reach for his tools. Instead, he sat quietly on the floor and opened his wooden box. He took out his pencil, a folded sheet of paper, and began to sketch the mechanism, tracing each path, every connection, searching for imbalance. Outside, the city moved on. Children shouted. Horses trotted. A bell chimed, late. He smiled gently. He had heard it too. Eventually, he found it, one gear, slightly misaligned. Just a few degrees off. Just enough to set the whole system wobbling. He didn't replace it. He didn't pull anything apart. He simply adjusted a small copper nut. Tightened one axis. Breathed slowly, and waited. And when the clock struck again, 11, sharp and low, the sound rolled across the rooftops like a wave returning to shore. He stood still, listening. Letting the tone settle into the stones. No one in the city would know that today's chime had arrived on time because of a quiet boy with a steady hand. And that was fine. He didn't fix clocks for credit. He fixed them so that things could hum the way they were meant to. He wanted the world to move in rhythm again, gently, softly, without notice. Before he left, he took a stub of pencil from his pocket, and on the inside of the wooden wall, he wrote. Behind every sound, there's a gear doing its best not to fail. Then he descended the spiral steps, the echo of the bell still resting in the space behind his thoughts. The afternoon sunlight slipped softly through the high windows of the workshop, falling across the benches like silk draped over wood. Tools shimmered faintly in the golden light, and the room, though busy, held a hush, like a library of motion and sound. The boy had become part of that rhythm. His movements were more confident, more precise. His presence no longer clashed with the space. He breathed with it, walked with it, thought with it. And then one day, a new figure appeared at the doorway. His name was Einar. He came from the north, short and broad-shouldered, with silver threaded through his dark beard and sharp eyes behind square-rimmed spectacles. He wore a leather apron that hugged his torso tightly, the edges stained with years of grease and ash. His boots struck the stone floor with a deliberate, almost percussive rhythm. The master of the shop gave no elaborate introduction. "This is Einar," he said, "you'll work under him for a while." Einar gave a single nod. Then, without ceremony, he placed a pocket watch in front of the boy. "Fix it," he said. "No replacements. Original parts only." The boy picked it up with care. The watch was old, its case worn smooth at the edges, a thin crack running across the face. The minute hand was frozen at 3:15. Inside, the gears were aged, some with orange rust along their edges, others barely clinging to their spindles. It wasn't a nightmare, but it was no simple fix. The boy nodded once, quietly accepting the challenge. That afternoon, he sat alone at the corner bench, the same place where he often worked in silence. The sounds of the room faded around him as he disassembled the watch piece by piece, laying out the components like tiny bones from a mechanical creature. Einar didn't hover, but he was never far. He watched with a practiced gaze, not distrusting, but measuring. "You're too gentle," he said at one point. "Sometimes, metal needs a firm hand." The boy didn't argue. He simply held up a trembling spring between his tweezers, letting it catch the light, shimmer slightly. He wasn't afraid of force. He just preferred listening first. They came from different worlds. Einar was a craftsman carved from fire and years of labor. The boy was shaped by stillness, by the quiet rhythms of turning gears and unspoken understanding. As dusk fell, the workshop emptied. Only the two of them remained. Einar sat near the furnace, shaping a copper rod with careful strokes of a file. Across the room, the boy continued his work. He was nearing the final layers of the watch now, the heart of it. Then, a soft click. The minute hand twitched. Einar looked up. They stood side by side, staring down at the tiny mechanism. Tick. Tick. The sound was soft, yet sure. Not loud, but undeniable. Einar nodded once. Good. It wasn't praise. It was recognition. And the boy understood, this was the beginning of a bridge between them. In the days that followed, Einar began teaching him things no one else had. The intricacies of compound joints, the ways to bend metal without weakening it, the art of embedding fine circuitry into a wooden shell. He shared without lecturing. The boy listened without needing to be told twice. And then, something changed. The boy began to speak more, short questions at first, then longer thoughts. He spoke about tension, about how pressure affected balance, about why certain gears hummed instead of spun. His ideas were simple, but full of insight. Einar listened. One morning, Einar handed him a key. To the upper cabinet, he said. You've earned it. The boy took it slowly, the brass cool in his hand. He looked at Einar and asked, why now? Einar's mouth twitched into a rare smile. Because you hear what metal says. From that moment on, they worked not as teacher and student, but as two minds in quiet dialogue. They didn't always agree, but they always understood. Two different hearts. One shared rhythm. It was a quiet evening in late spring when an old bell arrived at the workshop. It came from the ruins of a monastery in the northern hills, its once bright bronze now dulled with patches of rust, its face faded, its sound long forgotten. The men who delivered it said, it no longer rings, but someone hopes to hear it again. Many gathered to look. It's too old, one said. Too heavy, another added. Not worth the time, a third muttered. But the boy stepped forward. He crouched beside the bell, ran his fingers gently along its cracked frame, then tapped it lightly with his knuckle. No echo answered. Not even the faintest metallic vibration. It was as if the bell had become stone. Still, he turned to Einar and said softly, I'd like to try. Einar didn't speak. He only handed him a clean cloth and a heavy box of tools. Together, they moved the bell into a corner of the workshop, a quiet place, half in shadow, where the sun didn't often reach. But the boy thought, perhaps that was where it wanted to be, away from noise, near the hush of memory. And so began the quietest of repairs. Each day, while the workshop clanged and sparked with hammers and gears, the boy worked in silence. He peeled back the rear plate, revealing a mechanism long surrendered to time. The gears were corroded, some fused, others fallen, like bones in a forgotten body. The pendulum was broken. The bell hammer rusted stiff. Its heart had stilled. But he didn't rush. He cleaned each piece with gentle patience. He used soft brushes, cloth soaked in oil, and careful fingers. With each stroke, he whispered small thoughts, questions to the bell, or maybe to himself. Do you remember your first sound? He murmured once. Was it on a windy day? Einar passed by sometimes, pausing only briefly before continuing on. He knew better than to interrupt. Some machines needed conversation, not commands. As days turned to weeks, the bell began to shift. Not visibly, but in energy. It no longer seemed asleep, just waiting. One night, the boy dreamt of it. In his dream, the bell hung from the branch of a massive oak. The sky was pale. Around him were rolling hills and flocks of doves. He reached up, touched the bell, and it answered, not with a chime, but with a long, low murmur, like a memory trying to remember itself. The next morning, he returned to the workbench with new eyes. He adjusted the hammer arm, not for volume, but for tone. He reshaped the support so that vibrations would travel slower, gentler. He wasn't rebuilding a bell. He was rebuilding a voice. On the 26th day, he placed the final piece, a tuning rod, aligned and tightened with a single, careful breath. He stood back and turned the winding lever. The pendulum, once still, began to sway, slow and steady. Click. Click. He looked at Einar. The older man gave a quiet nod. And then, at last, he stepped forward. Just like when he was a child, long ago in a smaller town, he reached out and pressed the trigger. The bell rang. Not loudly. Not brightly. But deeply. The tone filled the room like mist, soft, reaching, carrying something older than sound. A memory, half-formed. A story, half-forgotten. Around the workshop, hands stilled. Tools were set down. No one spoke. They listened. To a bell that had not sung in years. To a voice that had returned from sleep. And the boy smiled, not wide, not proud, but softly, as if he too had remembered something precious. On the far western edge of the city, past the busy markets and quiet courtyards, there was a street many had forgotten. Once it had been alive with hammering, weaving, and whittling, the hands of smiths, tailors, and carpenters shaping the rhythms of life. But now, only the faded signs remained. The shutters were closed, the doors silent. Weeds grew undisturbed on window ledges. One misty morning, the boy followed Einar through those winding lanes. "We're going to visit someone," Einar said softly. "A man who built things no one else thought of. No one remembers him anymore." The boy didn't speak. He listened to the sound of his boots on uneven stones. Some were loose beneath the soil, giving a soft creak with each step, like the street was trying to speak in sighs. They stopped in front of a house almost hidden beneath vines. The door was ajar, not locked. The boy gently pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of oil, wood dust, and old paper. Sunlight filtered through broken glass panes in the roof, scattering light into soft beams that hovered like fog in the stillness. The space was cluttered, but not chaotic. Gears, broken frames, curled scrolls of sketches, and unfinished tools rested in quiet places, as if each was asleep in its own dream. Some devices were impossible to name, not machines, but thoughts given shape. In the far corner sat an old man on a low stool. He was small and thin, wearing thick round glasses that slipped down his nose. His white beard reached his chest, and his hands were stained with grease and graphite. He held a delicate, wind-up object between his fingers, something like a shell, something like a compass. Einar only said, brought someone to see your things." The man didn't look up. Instead, he twisted the small object once, gently. A thin metallic leaf unfolded and began to turn, catching the faint light. "It mimics the direction of wind," the old man murmured. The boy stepped closer, crouching beside him. He watched carefully, noting every tiny movement of the rotating leaf. No buttons. No wires. Its motion was delicate, not practical, like a petal stirred by breath. "It's not for use," the old man added. "I made it because I wanted to hear the wind." The room was silent. They stayed there for a long time, the boy and the inventor, without hurrying. Slowly, the man began to show more of his work: a windowsill that collected dew at dawn, a latch that closed itself under strong light, a string that gently vibrated under moonlight. "These don't solve problems," he said quietly. "They just say hello in different ways." And the boy understood. He had never heard the world explained like this, so softly, without the need for reason. Before they left, the old man handed him a small cloth bundle. "It's a half-finished mechanism," he said. "If you can make it move, it's yours." They walked back through the quiet streets in silence. When they returned to the workshop, the boy opened the bundle. Inside was a tiny coil, barely the size of a button, wrapped in the thinnest wire he'd ever seen. At the center was a micro-spring, barely held in place. He placed it gently on his bench. It didn't tick. It didn't shine. It waited. He studied it like a poem in an unfamiliar language. And then, slowly, with the same care he had learned from forgotten streets and gentle voices, he began to open it, piece by piece. The first breeze of autumn came quietly that year. The city's trees began to shift in color, from dusty green to pale gold, as though even the leaves were ready to exhale. The workshop, too, felt different. Orders slowed. Tools rested longer between uses. And the silence began to settle more often, like a familiar guest. The boy had been thinking about one thing for days. The small mechanism given to him by the forgotten inventor. He had worked on it for nearly 2 weeks. It did not behave like a typical coil, nor resemble any known device. It was not a watch. Not a meter. Not a clock. It felt alive. He often dreamed of it. In one dream, the mechanism floated in the sky, rotating gently, surrounded by stars that hummed with faint music. In another, it sank into a deep sea, glowing softly, guiding him through sunken corridors of stone and memory. Einar never interfered. He would pass the bench sometimes and leave quiet advice: perhaps it doesn't want to function. Perhaps it wants to be heard. One evening, just before dusk, the boy stood at his bench. He placed the completed mechanism into something he had built by hand, something that didn't have a name. It looked simple: a wooden base, 2 concentric metal rings, and a thin copper pin rising from the center like the stem of a flower. Around it sat 5 open compartments. Inside each were pieces he had gathered from across the city: a sliver of bronze from an old cathedral bell, torn pages from a discarded journal, splinters from a carved music box, and 2 wafer-thin sheets of unknown origin that shimmered like frost. He arranged each with quiet precision. Then he turned off the workshop lights. The room filled with soft darkness, not cold, but deep, like the inside of a lullaby. He sat. and waited. Then, with the lightest touch, he pressed a tiny switch at the base. Nothing happened. No light. No hum. No turning gears. He simply sat there, breathing slowly, as if waiting for a message to arrive, one that had crossed oceans and decades to find him. And then, a sound. So faint, it could be mistaken for a thought, a soft resonance, like wind passing through a hollow shell, or the murmur of flame brushing old paper. The bronze fragment inside the first box gave a tiny tremble. A ping, pure, clear, almost not there. Then the second box, a whisper of a page lifting itself, as if turning in a dream. The copper pin shifted, one notch only. No rush. Just one quiet decision. Einar entered the room but didn't speak. He stood at the doorway, hands behind his back, eyes on the machine. Together, they watched. The device wasn't doing anything useful. It wasn't measuring time. It wasn't recording anything. It wasn't solving a problem. It was remembering. "I don't think it's a machine," Einar said softly, as if afraid to wake it. "It's a space. A place that remembers wind. And light. And the feeling of dreams passing through you." The boy didn't respond. But he understood. Later, the machine was placed near the east window, the one that overlooked the river. No one gave it a name. But whenever someone walked near it, it responded. Not loudly. Not always. But with a quiet, low tone, like a memory stirred awake. Something soft. Something sacred. Something human. As winter quietly approached, the sound of the wind changed, thinner, gentler, more thoughtful. The windows of the workshop began to fog in the mornings, and by evening, thin lines of frost would curl across the glass like delicate rivers on an old, forgotten map. The city outside softened its pace. Footsteps slowed. Lamps burned warmer. Even time itself seemed to pause, just a little, for breath. Each night, the boys sat beside the machine. The one they still hadn't named, though people had begun to call it, the silent box. Every evening, it spoke in a new voice. Sometimes a faint chime. Sometimes the rustle of paper. And sometimes only a slight tremble in the air, like a sigh held between thoughts. It was never predictable, never repetitive. It responded not to buttons or commands, but to presence. It behaved like memory, drifting in and out, arriving unannounced, lingering just long enough to be felt. One evening, the boy decided to begin recording its sounds. Not to keep them, but to understand them. To ask, how do sounds move through the world? Where do they go when they vanish? And how is it that, sometimes, without knowing why, we can still feel them? He drew on sheets of parchment, shapes of sound, lines that curved like breath, dots that marked the soft beginnings and endings of echoes. One sketch resembled a slow pulse, a long wave that rose and fell as gently as sleep. He pinned it to the wall and wrote beneath it, "The breath of time." Einar stood beside him for a long time without speaking. They didn't speak much these days. Not from distance, but from comfort. Words had been replaced by a quieter understanding, the kind that tools and wood and metal know when they've worked side by side long enough. One snowy morning, they decided to clean the old storeroom. It was filled with decades of forgotten pieces, gears dulled by age, rusted hinges, blueprints faded to pale brown. Among them, they discovered a thick piece of parchment tucked between two boards. It showed a drawing of a strange device, four horn-shaped funnels circling a hollow center. "A speaker?" the boy asked, almost in a whisper. Einar nodded. "Not for human ears." He explained that the machine was designed not to send sound outward, but to send it inward, back through time, into the quieter layers of memory, into places not meant to be heard, but to be acknowledged. The boy couldn't stop thinking about it. He wanted to build it. So he began, melting old copper for the sound chamber, wrapping the wood in soft leather, tuning the interior based on the faint vibrations he'd mapped from the silent box. He worked late each night, often falling asleep on the bench near the window, wrapped in a blanket of drawings and tools. And finally, it was ready. He placed it on the table. The voice of time, he called it, though only to himself. The first night, silence. The second, still nothing. But on the third night, as snow began to fall outside and the air grew moist with the scent of melting frost, he heard something. Not from the machine itself, but from the workshop. From the floorboards. From the corners of the ceiling. From the tiny gaps in the window frame. A soft response. A hush, almost like someone saying, "I heard you." He sat in the quiet, unmoving. It wasn't a moment of discovery, it was a moment of peace. Because he had learned something simple and profound. Sound never truly disappears. It waits, in walls, in dust, in stillness, for the right space, the right quiet, to be heard again. It was a windless night. The moon hung high above the city, distant and pale. The stars, though few, seemed unusually clear, as if they had been waiting all day for this moment of stillness. Inside the workshop, everything was quiet. Even the soft creaks of the wooden beams were easy to hear, like the gentle breaths of an old house asleep. The boy sat by the window. In front of him was the voice of time, resting in its usual place, still and silent. It hadn't made a sound in days. But that night, it felt present. As if it, too, understood that this would be its final whisper. He lit a small oil lamp. The golden light pooled softly over the scattered tools, the curled sketches, and the bundle of dried grass on the windowsill. On the wall hung the old sound drawings, those delicate waveforms and breath-like lines that now seemed like faint traces of distant dreams. Einar entered, walking slowly. In his hands was a small wooden box, wrapped in black cloth. He held it carefully, almost reverently. "It's time I gave you something," he said. The boy took the box and opened it. Inside was a small metal plaque, cool to the touch. Etched into it were the words, "What you listen to, listens back." The boy looked up. Einar smiled, quietly. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "This workshop was never only about building," he said. "It was always about listening, remembering, and waiting." That night, the boy turned off every machine. He closed the windows and dimmed the lamp. He let a single candle burn slowly, its light flickering like a fading thought. There was nothing else, just his breath, the soft crackle of wax, and the steady, invisible weight of silence. Not an emptiness, but a presence. A fullness. A space where every sound once made still lingered, gently. Outside, snow had begun to fall. It didn't make a sound. But it softened the air, laying itself over rooftops, paths, and memories like a quiet blanket. By morning, the sun filtered gently through the curtains, casting long, pale lines across the floor. The silent box remained untouched. It didn't move. It didn't hum. But it was there. Still listening. Time passed. The workshop remained. New apprentices came. Some stayed. Some moved on. And the boy, now a little older, began to watch over it all, not as a master, but as a listener. He didn't rush to teach them how to build. He taught them how to hear. The rhythm of a machine. The echo in wood. The breath of turning gears. And most of all, that soft, quiet voice within, which waits not to be understood, but simply acknowledged. That voice says, "Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the home where all things return." And so, 12 chapters fade into one quiet ending. Not a closing, but a continuation. In silence.